Okay, let me share my screen, if you will. All right, can you see that?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So, thanks for joining us, and for those of you who will be tuning into the recording, this is the fourth workshop in our School of Management Paper Development Workshop series. And lucky you, you're going to get a bit of a double whammy today, two for the price of one, because it occurred to me that there was no one seminar or workshop I could give on how to write a method section, given the fact that we use different types of methods in our research. And so I've asked our friend Afreen to deliver a workshop on how to write a qualitative method section, and I will be delivering a workshop on how to write a quantitative method section, as these will, as you can imagine, be quite different from one another. So the way this is going to unfold is that I will deliver my workshop first for 20 minutes, and then I will pass over to Afreen, who will deliver her workshop for the remaining 40 minutes. We feel that there should be a bit of a disparity there rather than 30-30, because the amount of intellectual effort that goes into writing a quantitative method section is quite minimal. That's not to say that the intellectual effort that goes into quantitative methods is minimal, but this isn't a workshop on methods, but rather how to write up those methods. So without further ado, I will begin my presentation. And as always, I will start off with a brief review of the third workshop, which we held, it must have been about 2 months ago, on writing a literature review and a theory section. So what we discussed in the previous workshop was the idea that a literature review is not, or at least should not be, simply a list of papers. This person said this, and this person said that, and this person said this. What we discussed was the importance of taking previous work, and before you actually start writing your literature review, seeking to cluster those papers that you've identified into different themes, and then taking those individual papers once they're clustered into those themes and really critiquing them and comparing them and contrasting them, right? Not just a list, but a real deconstruction of that which has been written before on a particular topic. So the big picture underlying an academic literature review is that it communicates, in the first instance, what has been said about the topic already, whatever your topic of choice is. You've done a thorough evaluation and examination and assessment of what has been researched already on this topic. Secondly, on the basis of one, you would then move on to identify what still hasn't been said, because believe it or not, in spite of the exponential growth in academic literature over the last couple decades, there are still many things we don't understand. And then lastly, at the very end of your literature review, you would then move on to discuss how your particular paper fills that gap, right? That how your particular paper identifies what the lacuna are in the literature. So I would say also, just very briefly, so we can move on to the workshop today, where relevant, the literature review and the theory sections should build up a compelling narrative, right? Something that captures the reader's attention, and that narrative should lead up in turn to the paper's hypotheses. Obviously, that is in the context of quantitative research. So that's a very brief recapitulation of what we discussed. And now, without further ado, I will talk about writing a quantitative methods section. Now, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, I feel like there's very little to say in terms of writing a good quantitative methods section, because really writing up this section is pretty easy. And I would start by pointing out that if you're spending more than a day, that is a full day's writing, maybe, I don't know, I can't write for a full day. So for me, a full day's writing is about 4 hours. So if you're spending more than 4 hours or so writing up a quantitative method section, then you're probably spending too long on it and you're obsessing over something that doesn't need to be obsessed over. There's very little, as I said at the beginning, intellectual effort involved in putting together a quantitative method section. These are almost replicated from paper to paper. So you already have a template that you can work from if you've already published a quantitative methods paper. And there is very little room for the incorporation of citations and debates. There may be some reference here and there to relevant citations or methodological debates, but they certainly will not draw on and on in your method section, because this isn't the place for those types of debates, epistemological discussions. So what I've done for my presentation today is broken up what I consider to be the 4 key ingredients that are typically found in a quantitative method section. And these 4 are in I guess the order that I would tend to write them. Number 1, a description of the data, right? Tell us a bit about the data. Was it secondary data? Was it primary data? Number 2, some information is necessary on the sampling technique, and if you can, reporting some basic demographics of the sample that you're using in the method section. Number 3, you would need to include some exposition of the survey design and the item construction, right? So listing out the items that you used to measure the variables that you've measured in your paper. And then lastly, you would wrap up with a brief overview of the analytic, that is to say, the statistical technique that you use to analyze the data you've just described. And I would say, this is a generalization, there probably are exceptions to this, but I would say that you should probably be able to write all of this, your whole method section, in less than 5 pages or so. And when I say less than 5 pages, I mean 5 pages, double spaced, 12 point, Times New Roman font. So that's the general overview, a general description of what a quantitative methods section might look like. So let's now go through each of these 4 components briefly and see if we can look at these categories with a bit more granular detail. Okay, so I mentioned in the previous slide that the first thing you need to do in a quantitative methods section is to write up and describe the data that you've used in order to conduct your analyses. Now, if you're using secondary data, that is to say a data set that has already been collected, then you would need to start by identifying which organization collected those data, and importantly, who funded the study, right? The funding of the study is an important element of those ingredients so that people can understand the background to the study. If you're anything like me over the last, say, 2.5 years, you've probably made good use of secondary data. And the reason is that the collection of primary data throughout the COVID pandemic has been really quite difficult. And so I have turned in the face of those difficulties to using secondary data sets. So the paper that I'm working on as part of this paper development workshop series is using a secondary data set. And I did include in that paper information on the organization that collected the data and who funded the study. If you're using primary data, that is to say data that you've collected on your own, then you would need to identify certain information for the reader on how those data were collected, right? What method of data collection did you use? Where those data were collected. So what are the parameters of your population? Is this a US sample? Is this an Australian sample? And why they were collected. So what was the purpose? What were you trying to achieve when you administered this particular survey? The next issue that you would tend to want to discuss in the first section of a method section is what type of study is this? So in the context of quantitative research, we've got a couple options. Was this a survey study? Was this a survey-based study? Was a questionnaire administered to a set of individuals? Was it perhaps an experimental study where you had a controlled environment? And if it was an experimental study, you would have to describe that controlled environment. So what made it controlled? How was in the event of a survey, how was that survey administered? Right? You would need to describe whether your data were collected face to face, whether you had an individual going out face to face and collecting information and maybe reading the questionnaire off and circling the responses on behalf of the respondent. Was it done online? Was it done via telephone? Was it done via post, via the mail? This method of administration is important information for the reader to know. In what year were the data collected, right? That would seem to be an important, not only an important, I would say an essential piece of information so that the reader can understand the time frame surrounding your paper. Were the data cross-sectional, meaning were they a snapshot in time? Was it a one-off survey? Or are the data longitudinal, meaning that you have data over time that you have collected or employed? And I would say ceteris paribus, all else being equal, longitudinal data is viewed much more positively than cross-sectional data these days. And of course, don't forget to report your ethics approval number in your method section. Next, you would include a bit of information on your sample, and as I said, some basic demographics surrounding your sample. So the important information you would communicate here is how your sample was selected. In other words, what was your sampling frame, right? What was the population that you're using to draw a sample from, and how did you access that sampling frame? And quite important from the point of view of inferential statistics is what sampling method did you use or was used in order to select cases into your sample? Was it a non-random sample, in which case individuals in the sample were sort of thrown together at convenience, or was it a random sample where every member, every individual within that sample had an equal probability of selection vis-a-vis the wider population? And if it was a random sample, did you use simple random sampling? Was it a systematic sampling technique, a multi-stage area probability sampling technique, et cetera, et cetera? But what's important here is for the reader to understand what the key inclusion and exclusion criteria were in terms of why you included some individuals in your sample and why you excluded other individuals from the sample. And then at the end of this section, I always encourage people to report basic demographics from your sample, right? At a bare minimum, if you have this information, the gender of your sample, the breakdown in gender, the age demographics, race breakdown, if you have that, and education, and any other relevant demographic factors. And if there are significant differences vis-a-vis the population, this would be the opportunity for you to note those differences, right? So if your sample is, I don't know, 70% female rather than 50%, that would probably be something to observe and explain. Next section is survey design and item construction. So The key questions you would ask yourself here in writing up this section is, did you use your own measures, or did you use an established and already validated inventory that has already been uh, tested previously in previous research? And if you used your own measures or items, were they piloted, right? Have you tested them out on a smaller sample to evaluate their reliability and their validity? Generally speaking, I would point out that multiple measures, that is to say composite measures or the use of latent variables, are generally better than single item measures. Obviously that varies. It depends on what variables you're trying to measure. There are some variables, for example, in economics, it's quite unusual that they would need to use composite measures because they are quite simple to measure. But certainly in the School of Management, we do a lot of social research that would require, I think, multiple measures over a single measure. Now, I've seen a method section that some researchers only list a small sample of items. So they'll say, for example, we use this inventory and here's an example of 2 items. I think this is a mistake. I think it's important to list out every single item that you use. And if you use a huge inventory or many items, you can put this in an appendix if you need to. But as a reviewer, I'm always left dumbfounded by the fact that I can't see exactly what items were used to measure constructs when people only give a sample. And then, of course, lastly, I would point out that when you're describing which variables you used in your sample, you should categorize those variables as either independent variables, dependent variables, were they mediators, or were they moderators? Okay, and then the last thing you would mention in a quantitative methods paper is a very brief overview of the analytic technique that you use. So what quantitative method or set of methods, that is to say, that did you use to analyze the data? Now, if relevant, and I think that this is encouraged, is if you have an equation that you can actually spell out and articulate, you should insert that equation into your paper and then label each element of the equation. I find that that sort of level of clarity helps me as a reader when it comes to understanding econometrics. And if you need to, and increasingly you do need to, you should briefly defend the use of whatever statistical method you've identified and employed against other methods that could have been used, right? So, there are certain methods where there's a choice between one or the other. You can use logistic regression, or you can use probit regression or fixed effects. The options are there, and what you need to do is defend why you picked one particular option over the other. And lastly, you might want to just in one sentence indicate which software you use to analyze the data. Okay, so just in summary, I'm at the end of my 20 minutes. I would just point out that writing an academic paper, especially an empirical academic paper, is extremely time consuming. As I said at the beginning of this presentation, the data analysis, the quantitative methods that you employ to analyze data require a huge amount of intellectual input or effort. But the writing up of a method section, once you've done the analysis, really there's very little to it, which is why I don't have too much to say on this particular topic. If you're spending more than a few hours writing up your method section, I would say you're spending too much time. Equally, your results section, right? If you're doing a quantitative paper, your results section should also only take up maybe a day or two of writing, and we'll discuss this in the next workshop. But for now, I just wanted to flag that, when I write quantitative papers, I write the methods and the results sections usually in a single day. I may take weeks to analyze the data to get to the point where I can actually write things up, but there's very little to writing up a methods and a results section. The introduction, as we've already discussed, is pretty simple and formulaic, maybe a few days of work, maybe up to a week to do a good introduction. and your literature review and theory section and your discussion sections, now these can literally take months to write up. And that's why there was a 2-month gap between the previous workshop on how to write a literature review and this workshop, because the amount of intellectual effort involved in writing up a literature review and a discussion section is considerably more than the section that I'm talking about today. So I guess what I'm suggesting in conclusion is that your time is limited to work on a paper, and in the context of those limitations, you should really be prioritizing that time around refining and improving your literature review and your discussion sections, and just, you know, really do the best you can to get your methods section in order and develop a good template that you can then use to write other method sections. Okay, I think that is the end of my presentation, and I'm now happy to pass over to Afreen. I think probably the best way forward is for Afreen to present as well, and then at the end, if there are any questions, we can answer them together. Is that okay with you, Afreen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so over to you, Afreen.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you for inviting me to talk about developing methods section of a qualitative research paper today. And from the participants, let me also thank Jessica and Irene to join us today, and also those who will be tuning in into the recording. So basically, when you are developing a qualitative research paper, you will have to discuss the methods that you use to undertake the research. And this section basically explains what you did, how you did it, allowing the readers to evaluate the reliability and the validity of your research. So generally, the method section of a qualitative research paper would include the type of the research that you did, how you collected or selected your data, how you analyzed the data, any tools or materials that you used in the research, and your rationale for choosing these methods. Next slide, please, Andrew. Before getting into the steps of writing the method section, I just thought I would share this quote with you because I personally find this quote from Goya, Coley, and Hamilton from their 2013 paper a very helpful reminder for me about the important elements of writing the method section of a qualitative paper. So if you allow me to read through the quote, it says, "How can inductive researchers apply systematic, conceptual, and analytical discipline that leads to credible interpretations of data and also helps to convince readers that the conclusions are plausible and defensible?" And I think this quote captures the essence of a well-crafted method section of a qualitative paper. So keeping this in context, I've organized today's presentation into 4 steps, explaining the approach towards writing a method section, and I'll take you through them. Next slide, please, Andrew. Thanks. So in step 1, we would start with explaining our methodological approach. So we will begin with, say, introducing the overall approach to the research. What problem or question did you investigate? What kind of data did you need to answer it? We all know that qualitative methods are best for describing, interpreting, contextualizing, and gaining in-depth insight into specific concepts or phenomena. So depending on the particular purpose of your research and what you were set out to do, you will then start explaining your methodological approach. Next slide, please, Andrew. And just building a little bit on that, depending on your discipline and approach, you might also begin with a discussion of the rationale and assumptions that underpins your methodology. And this may include questions like, was your aim to address a practical or a theoretical problem? Why is this the most suitable approach to answering your research questions? Is this a standard methodology in your field, or does it require justification? Were there any ethical or philosophical considerations? And what are the criteria for validity and rigorousness in this type of research? So I would like to explain this with an example, which is in the next slide. Thanks, Andrew. And I took the liberty of, taking an extract of one of my own papers. I feel safe that way. So I'm just going to share it a little bit. The way the methodological approach was explained in one of my papers is our choice of research design is supported by previous studies who found phenomenological approach as most appropriate when investigating the phenomena of work-life balance by exploring the lived experience of women. And then I put some references there. Specifically, the aim of the study is to develop an in-depth understanding of how the participants make sense of self as a woman and an entrepreneur through conscious strategies for role blurring and boundary permeability, which was the focus of the study in the context of a patriarchal society. Thus, through inviting women entrepreneurs to talk about their experiences, our research process captured them making sense of these experiences, and as such became inextricably a part of the sense-making process. In so doing, the researchers necessarily assumed a fundamentally interpretative role. So that's just an example of how you can, go about explaining and positioning your methodological approach. Next slide, please, Andrew. Throughout the qualitative research and also in writing the methods section, it's also very important to reflect as a researcher and understanding the importance of reflexivity. So basically, reflexivity is about acknowledging your role in the research. As a qualitative researcher, you're part of the research process, and your prior experiences, assumptions, and beliefs will influence the research process. So researcher reflexivity is a type of critical reflection about the position you are taking as a researcher and how you have taken this stance into account in your research. So it's an important way to establish rigor, going back to the quote that I used earlier in qualitative research, similar to the process of defining measurement tools for validity as it would be in case of quantitative research. So just to give you a few examples of what being reflexive means, it would mean being attentive to the cultural, political, social, and ideological origins of your own perspective and voice as a researcher. It would also mean the perspectives and voices of those you include in your study in terms of interviewing them or observing them. And it will also include the perspective of those to whom you report your research. So, for example, in a qualitative participant observation, you might aim to produce ethnographic knowledge about the behaviors, social structures, and shared beliefs of a specific group of people. And as this methodology is less controlled and more interpretive, you will need to reflect on your position as a researcher, taking into account how your participation and perception might have influenced the result. Next slide, please, Andrew. Thank you. So step 2 will then involve describing your methods of data collection and or selection. So at this stage, you should give full details of the methods you used to conduct the research, outlining the tools, procedures, materials you used to gather data, the criteria you used to select participants or sources, very similar to the way Andrew described, giving information about the demographics and the characteristics of your participants and so forth. So for example, if you have undertaken interviews or focus groups, you will have to clearly describe where, when, and how the interviews were conducted. You will consider answering questions like, how did you find and select your participants? How many people took part? What form did the interviews take? Were they structured, semi-structured, or unstructured? How long were the interviews? How long were they recorded for? And how did you record them? Another example could be participant observation, and if you have done that, then describing where, when, and how you conducted the observation, what group or community did you observe, how did you gain access to them, how long did you spend conducting the research, and where it was located. You would also want to comment on how did you record your data, meaning did you use audiovisual recordings or did you take notes and so forth. In qualitative research, sometimes people also use existing data. In that case, you will have to explain how you selected the case study materials, such as did you use texts or did you use images for the focus of your analysis, and you will need to explain what type of materials did you analyze and how did you collect and select them. So again, very quickly, I would like to show an example of a qualitative methods in the next slide. So I'll just read a little bit. It says, using snowball sampling techniques, we contacted a total of 4 NGOs and social enterprises and 1 garment manufacturer, supplying the local market in Bangladesh to identify our potential participants, since home workers are difficult to locate and are isolated in their home. A total of 32 women home workers were interviewed, and then there were quite a bit of discussion about their demographics, characteristics, and inclusion criteria. Again, the other detail goes as the interviews were conducted in participants' home to observe the intersection of their work, family, and social context to gain a deeper understanding of their lived experiences. The interviews were based on a list of predetermined questions informed by our literature review, such as, and then the themes were discussed. And then it goes as each interview of between 60 to 90 minutes was recorded and then translated and transcribed. So just a little bit of summary of how you would systematically answer the questions that I've just mentioned about. Next slide, please. So then as step 3, you will describe your methods of analysis. And you have to be very careful about providing enough detail about how you processed and analyzed the data, but avoid going into too much detail. And you should not start presenting or discussing any of your results at this stage. So we know that in qualitative research, the analysis is usually based on either language, images, or observations. And your methods of data analysis could be content analysis, which involves coding and categorizing themes and ideas. It could be narrative analysis, looking at storytelling, structures and tropes and interpreting their meaning, or it could be discourse analysis, which means looking at communication and meaning, including language, images, and nonverbal interactions in relation to their social context. So in the next slide, I've put in another example from one of my papers. The interpretative phenomenological analysis, IPA, was used in that particular study. And I've already, kind of tried to create a justification for using it by saying that this approach was used to analyze the data. The purpose of using IPA approach was not to develop a generalizable account of these meanings, but to produce a legitimate theoretical analysis, which is accountable both to the study participants as well as to external readers of the account. The transcripts of the first 3 interviews were read in depth, making a note of anything important or interesting of work-family interface significance. Potential meanings were identified and recorded using keywords that captured the essential essence of what was being said, but which were also strongly grounded in participants' own words. And then, starting from the first interview, how we kept on following the patterns and the themes were further elaborated. Next slide, please. Okay, so step 4 is where you would want to evaluate and justify your methodological choices, especially if you did not take the most standard approach to your topic. So you'll discuss why other methods were not suitable for your objectives and show how this approach contributes new knowledge or understanding. You can acknowledge limitations or weaknesses in the approach you chose, but justify why these were outweighed by the strengths. For example, if you have used structured interviews, then you might want to say that structured interviews usually produce results that cannot be generalized beyond the sample group, but they provide a more in-depth understanding of participants' perceptions, motivations, and emotions. And you would justify using unstructured interviews if that was the key objective of your study with a particular group that you are researching. Next slide, please, Andrew. So in a nutshell, some of the tips for writing a strong method section. For me, this has worked pretty well, so I just thought I would share this with you. So stay focused on your objectives and research questions. The methodology section should clearly show why your methods suit your objectives and convince the reader that you chose the best possible approach to answering your problem statement and research questions. Throughout this section, you should relate your choices back to the central purpose of your research. Citing relevant sources is also very helpful. Your methodology can be strengthened by references to existing research in the field. As you have seen in the examples that I've used, I've always used references of other people who have used this methodology. And this is particularly helpful to confirm that you followed established practices for this type of research. It is also very helpful to discuss how you evaluated different methodologies and decided on your approach. It is also helpful to show that you took a novel methodological approach to address a gap in the literature. When writing the methods section of a qualitative paper, it's also very important to write for your audience, know your audience and write for them. So consider how much information you need to give and don't go into unnecessary detail. What I mean by that is if you're using methods that are standard to your discipline, you probably don't need to give lots of background or justification. But if you take an approach that is less common to your field, you might need to explain and justify your methodological choices. In either case, your method section should be a clear, well-structured text that makes an argument for your approach, not just a kind of list of technical details and procedures. And finally, don't forget to discuss the obstacles. If you encounter difficulties in collating or analyzing your data, then you should take time in explaining how you dealt with them. Show how you minimize the impact of any unexpected obstacles and preempt any major critics of your approach and demonstrate that you made the research as rigorous as possible. So that's basically it from my end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Afri. That was great. I'm getting a bit of feedback. I don't know why. But I really appreciate you stepping in to do the qualitative side of things. I've done a few qualitative studies myself, but I certainly would not have been able to share the extent of insight that you just shared. So it does pay to approach an expert, and it also pays to recognize when you're not an expert.
Which I'm not, but thank you, I'm honored. Thank you.
No, really good. So I guess, Jessica, do you have any questions for us?
You're on mute, Jessica.
No, she's off mute, but for some reason she's on mute. I saw her turn it off.
I put the microphone up higher.
That would do it, yeah.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you both. That was really, really helpful. I've written qualitative methodologies before, but I actually haven't written any quant methodologies. So it was really helpful to see you present on both. I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask, and it is more directed towards you, Afreen, because it's about the qualitative sample. Depending on the journal, I do get different responses as to what I think is the expected sample size when I'm doing interviews. And so I just wanted to learn a little bit about your experience with what you found to be a sample size that doesn't, I guess that's well accepted by the reviewers?
Good question.
Thank you for that question, Jessica. It's a really good question, and I guess we all struggle to really understand how many is enough, right? When it comes to finding your participants. But I still think, depending on the context of your study, if you're dealing with participants that are very difficult to identify and to be able to recruit for your study, then you will also choose your methodology accordingly. And you would want to then justify having smaller number of participants involved, right? So if you're doing, for example, if I'm doing a phenomenological study, then, and you're aiming at a highly ranked journal, they would want anything from 40 to 80 interviews at least, right? But if you're doing, say, case studies, using a life story approach, which I also did in one of my study, and because my participants were migrants who are also difficult to recruit, I did 14 interviews, and I kind of justified that I reached a saturation point and all that. So it is tricky, but I still think that if you're able to really provide justification for why this particular methodology and as such why the number of participants, then you will get a much softer, favorable response from your reviewers. I mean, there's no guarantee, but it's about how you position yourself and how you justify why that particular number is good enough. But I can tell you that for the paper that I'm really trying to get some feedback from human relations, I actually did 75 interviews to make sure that it qualifies as enough for a phenomenological study.
Yeah, that was how many I did for my thesis. But a question is, those 75 interviews, were they with different participant groups, subgroups?
They were with women entrepreneurs in home-based businesses, but they were from across multiple sectors. So from gender role related businesses to completely, male-dominated sectors. So I wanted to have a really wide representation of women in the context of Bangladesh, based in home, but undertaking businesses of all different sorts, coming from different sectors, so that I could actually make the story sell, in terms of its validity.
With that study, then, did you look at reaching saturation for each of those different that women across different sectors, or?
I did reach to a point where I was getting very similar responses, but I actually waited for saturation to occur in every particular sector that I was doing the interviews for, which is why I ended up having so many interviews.
Yeah. Because I had subgroups as well. I think the challenge that I found with that was, I think if publishing, I published one of the papers, which was just about one of the 5 participant groups, and I think it gives the room to go into the detail of what actually came out of those 20 interviews. But trying to publish a paper with all of this data, the 75 interviews across 5 different participant groups, I felt like it was very, I could just scratch the surface. I couldn't actually go into the detail that I think the paper needed, which I found that to be a challenge, because if you have such a large sample size with individuals from different participant groups, then I think the room or the space in the paper is not enough to really delve into that finer detail.
No, and I don't know the full detail of your study, but I would think if you have done 75 to 80 interviews, in-depth interviews, then you would want to have more than one paper out of this database, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So that's one other way of looking at it, really going deep into maybe one or two particular theme and aiming one paper on the basis of that, and then using the same data set but looking at something completely different relevant for that group, but completely different theme that hasn't been published in the other one.
That's interesting you say that, because I was thinking doing papers by participant groups, but you're right, doing it by theme, maintaining the same sample size as the large sample size makes a lot more.
Yeah. Yeah, and as long as you mention it very clearly to the editor that, this particular data set has been used and, this particular themes have been already published, and you provide them evidence of the data together with the paper, they're usually very quite accepting of the fact that, yes, it's the same data set, but essentially it's very different, fundamentally different analysis. As long as you can establish that it's a fundamentally different analysis based on different conceptual framework, then they wouldn't have any problem with it.
Great. Thank you.
There's always going to be some reviewer out there, usually reviewer 2, who says only 75, only. And another thing I would point out, just to add on this discussion, not like I know a lot about this, but I have a background in sociology, and there are a group of ethnomethodologists who publish papers with an N of 2. And the reason they can get away with publishing a paper with 2 respondents is that they interview for them for like 100 hours. They sit down for like a week and get so in depth that it's almost ridiculous. So I think it has, in my experience, reviewers and editors like to see that you've sweat blood to get the data. And oftentimes that translates into a certain number of respondents, but it can also translate into a number of hours that you've put into collecting the data. So you lengthen the interviews, you kind of make a better impression on them. But yeah, good question. I will take that we've reached the end of the seminar, and again I want to thank Afreen in particular. That was great for you to step in like that. And I guess we will leave it until the next workshop, where we'll be talking about how to write up a results section. And again, there will be some pretty significant differences between a quantitative results section and a qualitative results section. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.